In 1862, during the bitter cold of a dying winter, a hunting party stumbled across a forgotten church deep in the forests of upstate New York. Inside, beneath warped floorboards, they unearthed something that would never make the papers. 143 skeletons, every single one deformed by torture. Not buried, stored. Some with bones shattered and re-healed. Others carved with symbols no modern scholar has ever translated. That church had no name, but its founders, they did. The Ravencroft family, 3 brothers who preached salvation, not through prayer but pain. And for 30 years in plain sight, they ran what might be the most sophisticated death cult ever recorded on American soil. Government files were sealed, whistleblowers vanished, but a few classified pages leaked in the 1970s. And I've read them. What you're about to hear is dangerous, not just because it exposes a system that turned faith into a furnace, but because it mirrors systems still operating now, in boardrooms, in megachurches, in think tanks you've never heard of. The Ravencrofts weren't just madmen, they were methodical, brilliant, and most terrifying of all, they were successful. They mastered psychological control before the term existed. Built loyalty so deep that mothers offered their own children for ritual sacrifice, and no one stopped them. Why? Because every institution, religious, political, even educational, has its Ravencrofts. Only the names change. The game stays the same. This story isn't about the past. It's about you, and what happens when men fall asleep to the structures shaping their thoughts, their loyalties, and their sense of self. You were never meant to hear this, and once you do, you won't be able to unhear it. You'll feel the system around you differently. You'll begin to notice what's been hiding in plain sight. This is your descent into the macabre history of the Ravencroft family. And if you're ready, then open the door. Ezra, Silas, and Caleb Ravencroft did not grow up in Ravenwood. They were not local preachers gone mad. They arrived from nowhere. No documented birth certificates, no confirmed origin. They appeared in 1825 like smoke, and like smoke they suffocated the minds of everyone around them. Some say they came from the Hudson Valley. Others whisper they were born in Europe, the illegitimate sons of a Jesuit defector and a mystic woman who died during childbirth. What we do know, from rare letters and blacklisted census notes, is that the brothers arrived with wealth, books bound in languages no one could read, and eyes that didn't blink when confronted. Ezra, the eldest, had a military bearing. His voice was gravel, his sermon struck like hammer blows, slow, deep, deliberate. When he looked at someone, they stood straighter. Even local magistrates lowered their eyes. Silas, the middle brother, was always scribbling, hands ink-stained, robes dirtied, but never out of words. He wrote doctrine like others write love letters, obsessively, hungrily, as if decoding a voice only he could hear. And then there was Caleb, the youngest, the most terrifying. Caleb never raised his voice. He whispered, always. And yet, even from across a crowded hall, his whisper cut through louder than any bell. His eyes were pale blue, so pale they looked colorless, and they had a habit of rolling back in moments of silence, as if consulting something beyond the veil. Children feared him, animals avoided him, adults followed him. The Ravencrofts didn't start a church, they built a machine. Every word they spoke, every rule they gave, every gesture during a sermon was designed with purpose. From day one, they weren't interested in belief. They wanted obedience, not through threats, through transformation. They studied the revivalist movement, and sweeping the Northeast, mimicked their language, mimicked their fire, and twisted both. By the end of that first year in Ravenwood, they had 40 devoted followers. That might sound small, but those 40 would become seeds. Seeds watered in pain, seeds groomed to bloom in terror. The Ravencrofts didn't come to preach. They came to plant something ancient, something that had waited centuries to take root on American soil, and it grew. The Church of the Pure Spirit was unlike any house of worship the townspeople had seen. In an era where white-steepled chapels dotted the American landscape like moral lighthouses, the Ravencrofts erected something altogether darker, literally. Built from black granite quarried from the hills behind Ravenwood, the structure loomed like a mausoleum for the living. Its central chamber was octagonal, a design lifted from occult geometry, surrounded by 8 smaller chambers arranged with surgical symmetry, and not a single window pierced its walls. From the outside, it seemed like a prison. From the inside, it was worse. The interior was lit by lanterns suspended in iron spirals, their flames swaying in rhythms that made more than one visitor dizzy. The floor was carved, not painted, with symbols that Silas claimed were Proto-Egyptian, though no archaeologist has ever confirmed the origins. The pews were not traditional benches but cold slabs of polished stone, and in the very center of the sanctuary stood a platform, circular, elevated, and fitted with metal rings along its edge. They said it was a pulpit, but the local blacksmith who helped construct it said it looked more like a sacrificial dais. From the beginning, the Ravencroft spoke of purification through tribulation. They didn't smile. They didn't offer comfort. They promised pain, and people came. Why? Because pain, real pain, gives people meaning. The Civil War was looming. Disease, hunger, loneliness, these were daily visitors to the people of Ravenwood. The Ravencrofts didn't offer escape from suffering, they gave it a purpose, and that purpose made people feel seen, chosen, and necessary in a world that treated them like ghosts. Week by week, the rituals intensified. Silence became mandatory during services. Eyes were to remain open, unblinking, in reverence. Crying was allowed, but only as a sign of surrender. Ezra would say, "If your body shakes, let it. That's your soul trying to break free from the filth that binds it." Silas began distributing handwritten scriptures known only as the Thorns, and Caleb began laying hands. Those who were touched by him claimed visions of flames, of chains, of great celestial beasts devouring sinners in their sleep. Some wept and fainted. Others screamed. None ever turned away. The church had no windows for a reason. Light wasn't welcome there, only darkness, and what it reveals. In the winter of 1827, a strange sound began haunting the woods around Ravenwood at night. A rhythmic pounding, low and hollow like heartbeat through the earth. Locals assumed it was miners working late, but no one ever saw the workers. No shipments of stone ever left the property, and still the sound continued. What they were building wasn't visible from above. The Ravencrofts had begun constructing the catacombs. It started with a single spiral staircase hidden beneath a trapdoor behind the pulpit, a staircase that seemed to narrow the deeper it went, almost as if discouraging anyone not sufficiently purified from descending. Those chosen to enter were blindfolded, led by touch, told to count their steps in silence. Caleb called it the spiral of surrender. Ezra called it the test of worth. Silas, in his journals, simply called it the gate. At first, there was only one chamber, a stone room with walls inscribed in languages modern linguists still cannot decipher. But over time, more rooms were carved. The Ravencrofts told their followers these were spaces for deeper communion. In reality, they were staging grounds, each chamber with a purpose, each with a name. The chamber of silence, the chamber of bleeding light, the room of the second birth. They were building something sacred and monstrous. It was here that the doctrine of elevation was born. No longer was salvation about prayer or repentance. Now it required ordeal, trial, the breaking of flesh to reveal spirit, and those who survived these trials, even partially, were declared vessels. Vessels for what? That question was never answered directly, but the rituals began to reflect a disturbing shift. Participants were no longer just passive recipients of sermons. They were bound, submerged, burned, and returned, hollow-eyed, reverent, and changed. Caleb said they had opened their inner rooms. Ezra said they had been emptied. Silas, as always, wrote and wrote and wrote. The followers didn't protest. In fact, many begged to be chosen. Because once you've stepped into darkness willingly, you begin to fear the light. And the Ravencrofts knew, a man who fears the light is a man you can own. That's the first rule of control, and they had mastered it. It was December 21st, 1829, the longest night of the year, when the Ravencrofts performed what they publicly called the first elevation. But what they didn't say, and what only Caleb's private journal reveals, is this: it wasn't the first. It was merely the first done in public. The true first happened weeks earlier, in silence, in secret, and it ended in failure. The subject was a 14-year-old boy named Eli, an orphan, gifted to the church by a mother who believed the Ravencrofts would give her son purpose. He had shown devotion, fasted, memorized scripture, even volunteered to be a vessel, but something went wrong. According to Silas's notes, the boy resisted in his sleep. They called it spiritual rebellion. What it actually was survival instinct. He screamed, he fought, he begged. They didn't stop. Eli died after the fourth trial, the water trial, his lungs filled, not with holy revelation, but with cold, dark water from the spring beneath the church. Silas wanted to record the death as incomplete. Ezra insisted they hide it. Caleb, as always, found meaning in the suffering. He wrote, "The vessel shattered before the Spirit could pour in. We must craft stronger vessels." And so, 2 weeks later, they held the public ceremony. This time, they selected 3 adults, converts who had already shown trauma, loss, guilt, grief, the perfect cracks to widen. Sarah Pembroke had lost her child to fever. Michael Collins was a former soldier tormented by memories. Rebecca Winters, a former addict, had once attempted suicide. They were ideal, not because they were strong, but because they were already broken. The congregation watched the trials with reverence, chanted as instructed, wept when told to. What they didn't realize was that this entire performance was calibrated to hide the original failure, to overwrite the memory of a boy who died too soon, whose suffering didn't elevate but exposed the truth. The system wasn't divine, it was experimental. But here's the secret most never understand about cults, empires, and the machinery of control. The first lie is always sacred. The first failure is always buried. And once that lie is accepted, everything else becomes doctrine. That was the moment the Ravencrofts stopped pretending. They didn't want to save souls. They wanted to design them. By 1830, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown beyond ritual. What began as sermons and suffering had evolved into something far more dangerous: psychological redesign. The Ravencrofts weren't content to destroy the flesh. They wanted to control how their followers thought, how they dreamed, how they remembered. And to do that, they turned to methods few in America had ever seen or understood. Caleb was the architect of this descent. His visions, or what he claimed were visions, began to include maps of the soul. He described them in trance, whispering of corridors inside the mind, locked doors that could be opened with the right combination of pain and suggestion. Silas transcribed these rants obsessively, organizing them into what he later called the Manual of Submission. Ezra enforced it all like gospel. This wasn't religion anymore. It was reprogramming. They built isolation chambers deep beneath the sanctuary. No light, no sound, only the humming of stone and the slow drip of water from above. Devotees were kept there for days, sometimes weeks. No food, only whispered scriptures through a narrow grate. Ezra said it was for spiritual fasting, but the result was something different: hallucinations, ego death, obedience without question. Sleep deprivation followed, then repetition drills, phrases spoken thousands of times until they became truth. My pain is my teacher, my suffering is my gift, my body is not mine. Over and over, until the voice in your head becomes theirs. The result? Followers who couldn't distinguish their own thoughts from the doctrine they were fed, who cried tears of joy when chosen for elevation, who turned in family members for questioning authority, not out of fear but out of love. These were not victims anymore, they were assets. Even when the tortures became irreversible, broken limbs, brands, flesh removed in symbolic turns, most followers begged to return, because they had been emptied, and once a man is emptied, whoever fills him owns him. This wasn't madness, it was method. The Ravencrofts had discovered what modern intelligence agencies wouldn't admit for another century. Pain is not the enemy of control, it's the tool, and belief is just the lock. You are not born with your thoughts. Someone taught you what to worship. By 1832, the church's underground network had expanded so deeply into the hillside that new members no longer knew how far down they truly were when led blindfolded into the earth. Some believed they were still under the sanctuary, others suspected they were under the woods. The truth is, not even the Ravencrofts recorded a full map. Why? Because some things aren't meant to be mapped. One chamber in particular had gained an almost mythic status among the inner circle, the Chamber of Saints. At first, the bodies of the ascended had been buried in the fields, simple, secret plots marked only by stones carved with abstract glyphs. But soon Caleb insisted burial was a betrayal of sanctity. He claimed the bodies were vessels still containing fragments of divine light. They couldn't be buried, they had to be preserved, worshipped, used. And so, the chamber was born. Lit only by oil lamps behind frosted red glass, the Chamber of Saints was lined with stone shelves. On each shelf, a body, perfectly preserved, posed in states of spiritual ecstasy. Hands clasped in prayer, mouths open in silent song, eyes sewn open. Some were embalmed, some flayed and painted with gold, others stripped down to polished bone, adorned with fine silk robes. Silas documented their arrangement as a cathedral of perfected suffering. New initiates were brought here blindfolded. They would kneel before the bodies without knowing what they were seeing. Caleb would whisper in their ears, "Feel their presence. They watch you. They listen. They ache for your elevation." Many reported feeling a presence in the chamber, a chill, a vibration in the bones, a sense of being watched by something not quite dead. But here's what they didn't know. The chamber wasn't silent. In the hidden journals of Elizabeth Carver, one of the few high-ranking members to escape, she wrote that she once heard the corpses sigh. Not all at once, not loudly, but on certain nights when the wind above was still and the last lamp burned low, the silence would break. A breath, a whisper, a word in no known language. She believed, as Caleb likely did, that something had attached itself to the bodies. Not spirits, something older, something that watched and waited. Not every ritual created elevation, some opened doors, and the Ravencrofts never closed them. One of the most disturbing truths about the Ravencroft cult is also one of the quietest. While many tales of religious horror center around the manipulation of adults, desperate, broken, seeking meaning, the Church of the Pure Spirit did something even darker. They began with the children. At first, children were simply present. Followers brought their families. Infants cooed in stone pews. Toddlers sat cross-legged during sermons. But by 1833, the doctrine shifted. Ezra claimed that the untainted soul of a child made them uniquely receptive to the Spirit. Caleb, always the mystic, went further. Before the age of 7, the soul is not yet fused to the body. It can be shaped. And so the shaping began. The church opened what it called the School of Early Submission, a program for children aged 3 to 10. Parents were told their little ones would be taught scripture, humility, discipline. What they got was indoctrination laced with psychological warfare. Carver's journals, along with recovered lesson plans, describe the curriculum. No mirrors allowed, so the children wouldn't identify with their own bodies. Daily confessions, where children were urged to volunteer their sins and the sins of their parents. Long periods of enforced silence broken only by communal weeping sessions where the youngest were instructed to cry for the world's filth. Praise was given not for correctness but for surrender, for tears, for fear, for obedience. Some children were star pupils. Others vanished. Church records from 1834 to 1841 list 39 children as taken into spirit. No graves, no birth certificates, no traces, only a mark beside each name. A symbol Silas used often in his writings, sometimes as shorthand for elevated. other times as a symbol of completion, but in occult circles represents something far older, the seal of sacrifice. Rumors began in town. That strange music played near the woods at night, that small figures were seen walking in single file toward the church, heads down, hands clasped. A few townspeople whispered of screams, others pretended not to hear, and the worst part, parents offered them, freely, joyfully, believing it was the highest gift they could give, because once a man believes his suffering makes him holy, he'll offer anything, even his child. By the mid-1830s, the Ravencrofts introduced a rite so secretive, so devastating in its psychological effects, that even many inner circle members weren't aware it existed. It was called the Ritual of Unbinding. Its existence wasn't recorded in church ledgers, but it was whispered among the most loyal, the shepherds marked. And it wasn't for newcomers. It was for those who began to question. You see, not every follower remained blindly obedient. Some showed signs of fatigue, doubt, emotional collapse. But rather than cast them out, the Ravencrofts offered them something far worse, purification through remembrance. They called it unbinding from false cell. Victims were isolated for 40 days in a subchamber without light, sound, or time. Their food was reduced to fermented mash. Their language was stripped. They were forbidden to speak their own name, and they were not alone. Every 3 days, Caleb would visit, not to preach, to rewrite. Elizabeth Carver, one of only 2 known survivors of this ritual, described what happened during those visits. He would kneel beside me in the dark. I could feel his breath. He never touched me, but he would speak. Slowly. Your mother never loved you. She gave you away. Your pain was your fault. You killed your brother by being born. Say it. Say it. Over and over. I denied it. At first. Then I begged. Then I believed. Because that's the design. You break a man by isolating him from all evidence of who he was, and then offering him a new identity, only after he agrees to hate the old one. Silas called it psychic divorce. Ezra called it soul cleansing. Caleb, in one of his recovered scrolls, described it as rebooting the divine machine. Those who returned from unbinding came back hollow-eyed. They walked slower, spoke in hushed tones. Their original names were erased. They were given new ones. Biblical names, chosen by Caleb, names that aligned with ritual purposes. Elijah, Ruth, Jonah, not human anymore. Tools, ritual objects. And those who didn't return, they were buried beneath the chamber of silence, face down, bound in linen soaked with their own words. You see, the Ravencrofts understood something fundamental, something every modern cult, tyrant, and psychological manipulator also knows. If you can get a man to erase himself, you never need to kill him. He'll do it for you. By 1836, parchment was no longer the primary medium for doctrine. The Ravencrofts began to inscribe their sacred texts directly onto skin, not metaphorically, literally. It started, accord, to recovered correspondence between Deacon Silas and a physician in Boston, as an experiment in permanence. Silas had become obsessed with the idea that the Word of God, or at least their version of it, should be preserved in a vessel that was both sacred and mortal. He believed the decay of paper was a spiritual insult, but skin, he argued, decayed with dignity, slowly, like holy rot. They called it Dermata Evangelia, the flesh gospel. Volunteers were chosen from among the most devout. Some were alive, some weren't. Each received a portion of the thorns, the Ravencrofts' evolving scripture, tattooed with primitive tools. Ink mixed with ash from previously elevated vessels. Silas insisted that the ash carried remnants of divine insight. The word must feed on the word, he wrote. Each new gospel must grow from sacrifice. Some had verses inked on their backs. Others had the sacred spiral carved into their chests. But the most devout, the ones who begged to carry the full gospel, were flayed. Yes, skinned. Not all at once, over weeks. Carefully, lovingly. And their preserved skin, once dried and stretched, became banners that hung in the chamber of saints. You might think no one would agree to this. You'd be wrong. Because these followers had been taught over years that the highest purpose of life was to become part of the holy pattern, and when pain is your prayer, sacrifice becomes scripture. One surviving scrap of this flesh gospel was recovered in 1978 during an illegal dig by local treasure hunters. The text is in English but fragmented. Still, one passage stands out. Do not seek heaven above, for the body is the altar, the skin, the scroll, the scream, the ink. If you wish to speak to God, bleed the right words. These were not metaphors. The Ravencrofts weren't preaching a theology. They were building one, brick by bone, page by skin, tree, ooth by torment. And if you think this kind of devotion couldn't exist today, ask yourself, who's already tattooed their beliefs onto their bodies? Who's already branded by systems they don't understand? And what would they offer? If told, it made them holy. It was the equinox of 1837, a date the Ravencrofts marked not with prayer, but with purging. The ritual was called the Hymn of the Hallowed, and it remains one of the most gruesome events ever documented in their doctrine, not because of how it killed, but because of what it left alive. 13 followers were selected, all of them known for their voices, singers, orators, and readers. Ezra announced they had been too proud in speech, that their tongues had grown fat with vanity, and so, to cleanse them, the Spirit had requested silence, but not through meditation, not through fasting, through mutilation. The congregation was gathered in the sanctuary, lanterns extinguished. Only a single line of blue fire circled the spiral engraving in the floor, a special mixture of salt, sulfur, and oil. Caleb appeared from below, barefoot, robes soaked in what he claimed was oil of vision. He was not speaking English. He was chanting. The language, guttural and high-pitched, echoed through the chamber, triggering nausea in several attendees. Then, one by one, the chosen 13 were brought forward. Caleb kissed each of them on the forehead. Silas anointed their lips with black ink. Ezra raised a curved blade carved from antler, a relic he claimed was found in a dream, and placed it in their hands. They were made to cut out their own tongues. In front of the congregation, some hesitated, some screamed. One passed out, but all 13 were completed. The blood was collected in a ceremonial bowl mixed with powdered ash from prior vessels and smeared across the mouths of new initiates, symbolizing the transfer of wisdom from idful speech to sacred silence. And then came the most horrifying part. They began to sing, not in melody, in harmony, in unity, a sound no longer made by tongues, but from the throat, the chest, the teeth, a low, vibrating resonance that seemed to pulse from within the walls. Witnesses claimed the sound did not echo, but settled, as if the church itself were absorbing it, feeding on it. Elizabeth Carver, still young then, described it this way: "It felt like my lungs were filling with someone else's breath, not mine, not God's, something older, something colder." From that night on, the hallowed were considered holy, not because they preached the truth, but because they bled it. In the farthest alcove of the underground labyrinth, beyond the Chamber of Saints, deeper than the trial vaults, there was a room locked by 3 iron bars and a ritual code that only the 3 Ravencroft brothers knew. They called it the Vault of Ink. No candles burned there, no prayers were spoken, and only one object rested in the center of that room: a thick, black-bound volume resting on a stand of twisted bone and iron, held in place by silver cords. Its name, etched into the cover in blood-rusted nails, was Codex Sangrialis, the Blood Gospel. It was not for teaching, it was not for quoting. It was for controlling, written in a mix of Latin, Hebrew, Old Church Slavonic, and a cipher Silas invented himself. This book contained the raw blueprint for everything the Ravencrofts built. It held the true liturgies, far darker than those given to the flock. Rituals never performed in public, instructions on how to fracture identity, bind trauma to obedience, and summon what Silas called the empty watchers, beings not from heaven or hell, but from the space between suffering and surrender. Only 3 people ever read it cover to cover. 2 of them went mad, the third never spoke. Key again. How do we know this? Because pages of the Codex were discovered after the 1871 fire that destroyed most of Ravenwood. Charred fragments were smuggled out by a group of local men who'd tried to preserve the ruins. Those men died mysteriously within weeks. 2 by drowning, 1 by self-immolation. The last was found hanging upside down, his body carved with symbols from the text. Authorities buried the evidence, labeled it a case of collective hysteria. But 1 page survived in a private collection. A page that describes a ritual called the Offering of Eyes. It involves removing the eyes of a still-living vessel, placing them in a bowl of blood and ash, and chanting a phrase meant to reverse the soul's gaze inward, to make the subject see their true self, without lies, without identity, without ego. A spiritual mirror that never stops reflecting. This wasn't religion, it was technology, psychological and metaphysical. The Ravencrofts weren't worshipping the divine, they were trying to build it, from the inside out. 1 broken mind at a time. It was June 6, 1839, a date the Ravencroft followers would forever call the Day of Inversion. It began with silence. No bells, no chants, no summons. Only a letter, delivered to every household in Ravenwood at dawn, written in Silas's immaculate hand. Do not work, do not speak. Today you will see the truth with your skin. By noon, the sky above Ravenwood had darkened, though no clouds passed overhead. Birds ceased their songs, insects vanished, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then the horns began. Not brass, not anything man-made. It was a low vibration, rising from the very soil beneath the town, a sound so deep it rattled the nails in window frames and caused water to ripple in untouched glasses. Those who remember say it wasn't heard with the ears, but with the bones. That afternoon, the Ravencrofts all 3 of them barefoot, bare-chested, covered in black paint from the waist up. Caleb's eyes were completely white. Ezra's arms were bandaged from wrist to shoulder. Silas carried nothing but a book with no title. They walked slowly through town. No words, no gestures. As they passed, residents fell to their knees without understanding why. Some screamed, others sobbed. 1 woman went into labor spontaneously. It was as if something inside every person was being rewired, retuned, made vulnerable. At sunset, all 274 active members of the church were summoned to the sanctuary. There they witnessed the Great Inversion. It began with Ezra standing at the center of the spiral and declaring, "The world you see is a lie, and tonight you will walk upside down." Then, 1 by 1, the congregation was brought into the lower catacombs, where the chapel of inversion had been prepared, walls painted with mirrored images of hell as heaven, demons wearing halos, children seated on thrones made of teeth. In the center, a massive reflective basin, filled not with water, but blood and powdered silver. Each member was forced to kneel, stare into the basin, and whisper the 7 names of self they had carried through life. Then they were told, "Now you must drown them." And 1 by 1 the Ravencrofts held their heads beneath the surface until they convulsed, inhaled the mixture, and blacked out. What they saw in that reflection was never written down. But when they awoke, none of them remembered their own names, only the name Ravencroft. Because the point wasn't to show them the truth, it was to erase everything else. After the Day of Inversion, the Ravencroft doctrine changed. Not externally. The sermon still preached purity through pain, elevation through suffering, But beneath the surface, something irreversible had happened. The congregation had become a hive. No, metaphorically, structurally, unified thought, shared identity, centralized obedience. Caleb described it in one of his cryptic letters as the crystallization of faith into flesh. But as with any hive, not all cells integrate. Some remembered, not fully, not consciously, but fragments surfaced, faces they didn't recognize in the mirror, words they used to know, a birth name that echoed at the edge of dreams, and that was dangerous, because doubt spreads. The Ravencrofts responded with what they called the Mercy Protocol. It sounded benign. It wasn't. Any follower who showed signs of self-reclamation, journaling, whispering forbidden names, hesitating during chants, was quietly taken beneath the sanctuary, not punished, not beaten, buried, alive. The chamber was called the Womb of Silence. Constructed deep below the Chapel of Inversion, it held 12 narrow slots carved into stone, barely wide enough for a human body. Each was padded with black moss, each sealed with a slab engraved with a single phrase, "Let the old self sleep." The patients, as Silas referred to them in the Codex, were fed a slow drip infusion of sedatives and isolation scriptures. Some died within days, others lasted weeks. A few were recycled into elevation rituals, their minds too shattered to resist, their identities already half erased. Only one ever escaped. Her name was Naomi, though she forgot it for years. Rescued by a farmer after clawing her way out through loose soil behind the southern ridge, her fingers broken, her hair gone. Her first words were, "What is a mother?" She was 19. She died 2 years later in an asylum, never regaining full memory. But her sketches, still preserved, reveal things no outsider could have known: the spiral etched in blood, the bowl of silver and breath, the hollowed choir. Her final drawing was of a coffin, upside down, filled with mirrors. Because that's the second law of control. If a man starts to remember, you don't argue, you don't correct, you bury the memory itself and call it salvation. Every religion has its emblem. The cross, the crescent, the wheel, the lotus. The Church of the Pure Spirit had something else, something they called the spiral of becoming. At first glance it looked harmless, just a coiling line turning inward toward a black dot. It adorned robes, church walls, even the stone altar. Outsiders mistook it for Celtic or pagan, but it wasn't decoration, it was a trigger. Because this spiral wasn't merely drawn, it was installed, carved into the sanctuary floor at a precise mathematical ratio, 1.6181, the golden ratio, known to Renaissance artists and ancient architects alike. But where those men used it to evoke beauty, the Ravencrofts used it to manipulate perception. Silas, ever the scholar, had discovered that when this spiral was rotated counterclockwise while chanted scripture was played at specific frequencies, usually between 19 to 21 Hz, below the threshold of conscious hearing, it produced measurable physiological effects in followers: sweating, dizziness, hallucinations, and obedience. During elevation rituals, followers were made to crawl along the spiral path on their knees, blindfolded, while the tones played and the congregation chanted. By the time they reached the center, they weren't themselves. They were primed, softened, emptied. The spiral wasn't an image, it was a delivery system. In modern terms, it was a neural map, a symbolic virus uploaded into the visual cortex that, when combined with repetition and trauma, hijacked the nervous system. It's not fantasy, it's physics, and it still works today. Ever wondered why hypnotic spirals appear in advertising? Why cults reuse patterns and geometries with ancient roots? It's not by accident. Patterns bypass logic. They don't ask, they restructure. And the Ravencrofts understood this better than any psychologist. In one of Caleb's most chilling writings, recovered by federal investigators decades later, he wrote, "The eye is the gate, the spiral is the key. Open enough eyes and the world remakes itself." What he meant was clear. If you can brand a pattern into someone's soul, not their mind, not their body, but their perceptual interface, then every experience they have from that moment forward is yours. The spiral wasn't a symbol. It was possession, and thousands wore it with pride, never knowing it had already turned them inward, consumed them, and erased the exit. In the autumn of 1840, the Ravencrofts announced a sacred gathering unlike any before. They called it the Banquet of Becoming. Flyers were not distributed. There were no sermons leading up to it. Only a single phrase was whispered down the chain of loyal followers. Prepare the vessel. The feast is not for the mouth. On October 13th, nearly 200 members assembled in the main sanctuary. The air was heavy with incense, a mix of burnt myrrh, clove, and a sickly sweet musk that followers described as like honey gone sour. 12 tables had been arranged in a spiral configuration, each covered in white cloth stained faintly red. No plates, no cups, just a single black candle on each. Attendees were instructed to fast for 3 days prior. They were told the hunger was important, not to be satisfied, but to be redirected. Ezra opened the ceremony with a speech that would later be found written in blood beneath the floorboards. You have starved your flesh. Now you will feed your spirit. Tonight you become the knife, the plate, the meat, and the mouth. What followed was not eating. It was mirroring. At each table sat 2 congregants facing each other. Between them, a mirror. They were told to gaze, unblinking, into the reflection of the other. Not the person, but the image. Ezra called it the devouring of form. They were instructed to see not their partner, but the shadow beneath their face, the part that had been waiting to be named. This continued for hours. Some wept, some screamed, a few passing, out. Caleb walked the circle barefoot, smearing ash across foreheads. Silas chanted verses from the Codex Sangrialis, but backwards, a reversal meant to undo language and open the throat of the spirit. At the climax, each table was given a single white cloth. They were told to bite it, tear it, chew it as if it were flesh, and many did, not because they believed it was food, but because they believed they were the offering. Elizabeth Carver wrote, "The man across from me smiled as he chewed. Blood ran from his mouth. There was no wound, just joy. He whispered, 'I'm finally full.' No one died that night, but many were never the same. Because hunger is not just physical, it's spiritual, and if someone else defines your hunger, they control how you're fed." By 1841, cracks had begun to form, not in the Church of the Pure Spirit's walls, but in the minds of its most devoted. Dozens had undergone elevation. Hundreds had participated in rituals that blurred the line between death and transformation. But something darker began to stir. Not rebellion, not doubt, but splintering. Men who once screamed with joy during purification now wept in silence. Women who once offered their children for sacrifice stood frozen before the sanctuary steps, unable to move. Followers began to see things in their own reflections that weren't them. It began after the Banquet of Becoming, a subtle shift, an infection of thought. Several members reported waking from sleep and finding their mirrors darkened, not broken, not fogged, but black. No reflection, no face, just void. Others claimed their reflections moved when they did not, or mouthed words they never said. One follower, Jonah Hale, a former teacher turned vessel of light, tore his own eyes out with a sharpened cross after claiming his reflection smiled before I did. His final words, written in trembling ink on the chapel floor, "He's in me now. I didn't let him in, but he used my eyes." The Ravencrofts did not panic. They preached. Ezra declared it a sign of spiritual thinning, a proof that the veil between flesh and soul was dissolving. Caleb took it further, saying, "Mirrors are for the lost. The found no longer need to see." The next week, all reflective surfaces were banned from the church grounds. Mirrors shattered, water basins removed, even polished metal was covered. But it was too late. The inversion had taken hold. Carver described it in her secret writings. We became two people, one in the body, one in the spirit. But the spirit grew hungrier. It clawed up through us, and some couldn't hold the skin anymore. Sleepwalking became common. So did spontaneous fasting, mutism, and self-harm. At least 7 followers disappeared into the woods and were never found. These were not rebellions. They were feedback loops. The system the Ravencrofts built, a machine of identity erasure, trauma bonding, and psycho-spiritual engineering, had begun to consume itself. But instead of fixing it, they fed it. Caleb began wearing a mirror around his neck, not to look into, to aim at others. When asked why, he whispered, "It doesn't reflect, it remembers." In the winter of 1842, the Ravencrofts began what would later be described in suppressed federal files as the most ethically grotesque psychological trial ever conducted on American soil. It was codenamed, within Caleb's Black Codex, as Project Godseed, and its objective? To create faith from nothing. Until now, the Church had always preyed on weakness, trauma, poverty, grief. But Caleb theorized that true obedience could be engineered without suffering, if the mind was ruptured early enough. So they turned to children, not just any children, newborns, the youngest ever brought into the cult. 7 infants were selected. Some were born within the Church, others given by followers as holy offerings. These infants were placed in a subterranean chamber beneath the chapel of inversion known only as the Garden. There were no mothers, no lullabies, no names. Each child was raised by masked caretakers, chosen vessels who had undergone full unbinding and were instructed to never speak a word, not even to each other. The children grew in silence, fed by hands they never saw, cradled by figures who never expressed warmth. Light came from above, a shifting blend of candle glow and dimming lanterns calibrated to confuse time. Instead of stories, they were given symbols. The spiral, the sigil of tongueless song, the inverted tree. And instead of language, they were taught gesture, complex choreographies of motion that replaced words. By age 3, none of the children could speak, but they could worship. When Caleb visited the garden for the first time, he recorded, "They do not ask, they only offer, they do not think, they only kneel, they are pure, the vessel without question." What horrified later investigators was not just what the children did, but what they believed. At age 4, one child was shown a mirror. He screamed, not in fear of what he saw, but because he had never been told he existed. He thought the image was an invader, a god. When denied the mirror, he began to convulse, chanting gestures of sacrifice, offering his own hand to be taken. That boy died within a year from self-inflicted wounds. Caleb's note in the margin was brief. Too much self, too early. Next time, remove the eyes. Godseed was shut down by 1845. Or so they claimed. But photographs recovered in the 1970s show 7 stone cradles and 8 names in blood. The 8th was you. And if that unsettles you, it should. Because the 3rd law of control is this: you do not need to believe in the system only needs to believe in you. By 1843, the Ravencroft's power was absolute. The town of Ravenwood had become a husk, its citizens hollowed into ritualized obedience, its homes shadowed by the ever-expanding compound, its children silent, its fields untended. Even outsiders who passed through noted a strange stillness in the air, a pressure behind the eyes. Time itself felt stuck. And then, Caleb changed. He had always been the strangest of the 3. Ezra ruled, Silas documented, but Caleb listened. He claimed to receive visions, whispers from the Spirit. Instructions passed through dreams. But that winter, something shifted. He stopped speaking in English. At first he used only scripture, verses from the thorns, recited backward, then guttural tones no one recognized, and then, finally, a sound no human throat should produce, a clicking, hissing language that required the jaw to dislocate. It hurt to hear. It hurt worse to understand. Because somehow, some did. Followers began repeating phrases from this tongue in trance, waking to find symbols scrawled on the walls in ash, in blood, in feces. The chamber of saints trembled during sermons, candles flickered without wind. At least 3 long-devoted followers collapsed during services, blood dripping from their ears. One account, later redacted from federal archives, describes a night when Caleb stood before the congregation and began to convulse. His eyes rolled back, his neck twisted at a sickening angle, and he levitated. Witnesses swore he hovered a full foot above the spiral dais, not flailing, not writhing, still. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It wasn't human. It vibrated inside the listeners. He said, "You are the gate. You are the gate. You are the gate." 3 women miscarried on the spot. 1 man clawed out his own throat. After that, Caleb never returned to the surface. He remained in the catacombs deeper than anyone was, allowed to follow. His meals were lowered down in silence, his messages delivered via carved bone tablets. Silas continued to interpret his commands. Ezra enforced them. But the followers no longer worshipped the brothers. They worshipped what Caleb had become. Carver's final hidden journal entry said it best. Caleb is no longer a man. He opened the door, and something walked in wearing his face. Because the 4th law of control is this: if you stare into the dark long enough, it learns how to speak through you. We are now past the halfway point, and if you're still watching, you've already crossed the threshold. Not just into a story, but into structure. You're not the same person who clicked play. You've heard things most men were never meant to hear. Names etched in silence. Rituals designed not to kill, but to remake. So pause. Look away from the screen. Feel your breath, your hands. Ask yourself, who taught you what's real? Because from here on, we descend. And to lock in what's already beginning inside you, do this. Comment below, "I am the gate, I am the lock." Write it twice. Why? Because repetition is reinforcement, because engagement is digital blood, and because the algorithm, like the Ravencrofts, feeds on devotion. The rest of this story is not for entertainment. It is for transformation. And as you'll see in what comes next, by the spring of 1844, the Ravencroft doctrine had mutated into a living organism, its rules no longer written, but embodied. Followers no longer needed instruction, they anticipated it. Rituals were performed before being taught. Suffering was no longer feared, it was scheduled. But something strange began happening to the most devout. Their skin changed. At first, it was dismissed as malnutrition, a side effect of fasting, of underground life, but over time the transformation became undeniable. Vessels, those who had undergone 3 or more elevations, began to lose pigment, not just their skin, but their eyes, their hair, even their blood. Pallor gave way to porcelain, veins dulled, their eyes took on a milky glaze. Caleb called them the whitening. Silas recorded the phenomenon with clinical obsession. The flesh fades as the spirit takes dominance. Pigment is sin, blood is noise. We are being rewritten from within. But Ezra, ever the tactician, saw opportunity. He presented the whitening not as affliction, but as achievement. Those affected were elevated in status, given new robes, new names. A new chamber, the Hall of Vessels, was carved beneath the spiral sanctuary where they could dwell undisturbed. Followers began to pray not to God, not to Caleb, but to them. Because the whitened were no longer human, they were transmitters. Carver's notes, smuggled from the compound in scraps of linen, claimed that these vessels began speaking in tongues before being spoken to. They responded to questions never asked aloud. They wept during rituals no one performed, and their presence became corrosive. 2 children who entered the Hall of Vessels were later found mute, one blind, one never slept again. The vessels were not allowed to die. Even as their organs failed, their pulses slowed, their skin became translucent, they were kept breathing, hooked to crude machines, anointed in oils and powders to preserve what remained, because Caleb believed they were becoming living scripture. And the final goal? To produce a child from one. Yes, a new God born not from womb, but from whitened silence. There are sketches found decades later of a cradle, a spiral umbilicus, a bloodless fetus suspended in salt water and bone. They called it the Immaculate Absence, because when you erase the self completely, what's left behind isn't nothing. It's whatever was waiting in the empty space. It happened in the final weeks of 1844, though no public records confirm the date, and no birth certificate was ever filed. But multiple survivors, years apart and worlds away, told the same story. A child was born beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit, but not in the way the world understands birth. She was not delivered, she arrived. The ritual was called the reverse womb. It took place in the lowest chamber of the catacombs, beyond the Hall of Vessels, in a space carved with no tools, only human nails over years. The walls were lined with skin-bound scrolls. The floor was soft, like flesh, and at the center was a pool, salt water and silver dust, kept warm by hidden lanterns. Into that pool, the Ravencrofts lowered what they called the archive, a composite of 3 whitening vessels fused by ritual scarification and symbolic death. They did not breathe, they did not speak, they did not resist, they simply accepted. And at midnight, without contraction, without sound, something emerged from their joined bodies. Not crawling, not crying, breathing inward. Elizabeth Carver, hiding in the ducts above, recorded what she saw in 4 brief lines, etched with charcoal onto a strip of leather. It had no mouth, it had too many eyes, it breathed like prayer in reverse, and everyone wept, including the stone. The child, if it can be called that, was named Sorrow. Caleb announced her as the final spiral. He claimed she was the completion of everything they'd built, not a prophet, not a vessel, but the message made flesh. Sorrow was never allowed to touch the ground. She was suspended, cradled in a sling of braided hair from all the elevated dead. Her skin was colorless, her hands webbed, her eyes never blinked. And when she spoke, only once. It wasn't in a voice. It was in a room. The lamps shattered. Blood ran up the walls. 10 followers died from aneurysms. Ezra collapsed. Silas gouged his thigh and Rue to new gospel in the wound. Caleb only smiled. What had emerged from the reverse womb was not salvation, it was syntax, something that made language irrelevant, identity obsolete, and death optional. They didn't worship sorrow. They waited for her to finish dreaming. Because the 5th law of control is this: if you can create something that doesn't need you, you have become God. By early 1845, the Ravencrofts had become myth, even within their own walls. Caleb was no longer seen. Ezra no longer spoke. Silas wrote only in spirals. The congregation functioned without instruction, rituals continuing like clockwork, pain administered like prayer. But 4 men, 4 who still remembered who they were before, tried to end it. They called themselves the Last Sons. 3 were former followers: Nathan Hale, a mason, Ephraim Jones, a preacher, and Samuel Baird, a miller. The 4th was an outsider, Thomas Liddell, a federal surveyor who'd come to Ravenwood to investigate irregular land grants and had been quietly imprisoned for 6 months in the Chamber of Drowning. He escaped by swallowing his own tongue, just enough to fake death. The 4 met in the woods west of the compound. Each had seen things, each had buried things, but they were united by a single truth: Ravenwood could not be saved, only burned. Their plan was simple: breach the upper sanctum during the winter solstice, when all followers would be gathered in silent reflection, and ignite the lantern oil stores beneath the sanctuary. But there was a problem. The church refused to burn, literally. Nathan Hale's testimony, recorded just before his suicide in 1861, describes how he poured 5 gallons of pitch across the sanctuary floor, lit the match, dropped it, and watched it hover, the flame suspended an inch above the surface, flickering violently, refusing to touch the spiral below. Then the whispering began, not from voices, but from the walls. Dozens of mouths, tiny, human, opening and closing in the grain of the wood, beneath the stone in the candle wax, chanting in Caleb's dead tongue. Samuel Baird ran. They found only his boots the next day, facing backward, filled with teeth. Ephraim Jones wept as the sanctuary doors slammed shut and the lanterns inverted their light, casting darkness instead of flame. He began reciting his own birth date, over and over, as if trying to remember something no one had ever told him. Only Thomas Liddell escaped again, but not unchanged. He was found naked weeks later, 40 miles north, carving spirals into the walls of a Quaker schoolhouse, his body covered in bite marks, his eyes missing. He could not speak. But on his chest, burned into the flesh, were 4 words: "This place does not end." Because that's the 6th law of control. If belief is deep enough, the system defends itself. By midsummer of 1845, Ravenwood had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that settles over mass graves. The postmaster's office closed. The tavern stopped serving. Trade routes shifted around the town like water bending around rot. Even animals avoided the perimeter. The birds stopped nesting in the trees near the steeple. The dogs howled at nothing. The soil hardened. The Church of the Pure Spirit had become a wound in the land. But it wasn't dead, because something still moved inside it. Travelers who passed near the compound in July of that year reported lights at strange hours, not from fire but something colder, a glow that pulsed, not flickered. A few claimed to hear what sounded like singing from beneath the earth. Others said they were watched, not by eyes, but by the absence of eyes. The structure had gone silent, but the silence began to listen. In her final testimony before her disappearance, Elizabeth Carver wrote, "There were no sermons that week, no food, no sound, only the spiral. Every hour, on the hour, we were made to kneel before it. We were not allowed to speak, not allowed to think." And then the silence answered. She described an event known only to insiders as the reply. The congregation, now numbering just under 200, gathered in total stillness, underground. No torches, no scripture, no guidance. Then, from the farthest chamber, the place where sorrow had been kept suspended, came a low, grinding exhale, like a breath taken backward. The walls dripped with condensation. The spiral on the floor began to turn, not metaphorically, physically. The stone shifted beneath their knees, and from every corner the same phrase rose up, not spoken but transmitted: "We see you seeing." Some went mad on the spot. Others clawed at their faces, trying to unsee. Carver fled through the southern drain tunnel, bones broken, voice gone. She wrote her final note with charcoal and her own blood. We were the prayer. It was the mouth. That was the last confirmed contact with anyone inside the compound before the fire of 1862. But even that fire, the one the government claimed ended everything, didn't reach the deepest levels. Because structures like this don't live in wood and stone. They live in silence. And silence always survives. In 1957, over a century after the official end of the Church of the Pure Spirit, a topographic surveyor named Raymond Kirsch was contracted to chart mineral deposits in upstate New York, a routine task. He'd done dozens, but near Ravenwood, his instruments began to fail. Compasses spun, radio signals vanished, equipment recorded subterranean structures that didn't exist on any geological register. Kirsch hand-mapped the terrain anyway. But when he returned to his hotel that night, something impossible happened. His map had changed. Lines he hadn't drawn now carved across the parchment. Perfect spirals, concentric chambers, and at the center, a black dot, a symbol identical to one found in Silas Ravencroft's private codex. Raymond assumed it was a prank, till it happened again the next night. A new map, new lines, more detail, as if something underground was using his hand to reveal itself. By the fifth night he woke to find the map completed, and blood on his pillow. Not from his nose, from his ears. He mailed the map to his supervisor and disappeared. 2 months later, his body was found floating in a reservoir 30 miles south. His hands had been removed cleanly. The coroner listed cause of death as drowning due to voluntary immobility, but the map survived, and it confirmed a horrifying truth. The Church of the Pure Spirit hadn't been just a compound. It was a system, a massive engineered structure stretching almost a mile underground. Chambers, wells, tunnels, spiral ventilation shafts, sacrificial cisterns. Some of it was clearly dug by hand, but other portions machined. Modern engineers who reviewed the drawings couldn't explain how the curves were achieved in 1840 without advanced tools, or why the angles of certain tunnels matched the golden ratio, or how the echo chambers aligned with known resonance frequencies of the human brain. But what disturbed them most was what the central black dot led to. A chamber with no doors, no stairway, no exit, just a perfect circle of space located beneath the heart of the spiral, unlit, unfurnished, untouched. One engineer called it the empty room that dreams, because from that void, the rest of the structure seemed to grow. You see, the Ravencrofts didn't just build downward, they built inward. And the seventh law of control is this: if you carve deep enough into the human soul, it will start carving back. In 1971, a researcher named Dr. Alma Brecht was granted rare clearance to review sealed federal materials relating to Ravenwood, NY, subject code RAV-13. These boxes, long hidden in a sublevel of the Library of Congress, were marked Cult Activity, No Rele. ASE contains unsanctioned materials. Inside, she found what she would later call a manuscript stitched from the skin of silence. It had no official title, no author signature, just one line scrawled on the inside of the leather binding. What remains? Rewrites. The archive consisted of 342 pages, handwritten, erratic, and gradually more illegible. Some in English, some in symbols, some in mirror script, some in what linguists later confirmed were extinct tongues, Ugaritic, pre-Sumerian glyphs, even fragments resembling linear A. But it wasn't just text. The ink was human. The pages, microscopic analysis revealed, were bound in dermal tissue, 3 different genetic profiles. At least one matched an unidentified female corpse exhumed from Ravenwood's outskirts in 1909. And then there was the heat. Dr. Brecht described the pages as warm to the touch, even when removed from all light or ambient sources. One assistant suffered 3rd-degree burns from prolonged exposure. Another began sleepwalking after 2 hours of transcription. The archive pulsed, and worse, it changed. Photocopies made during study did not match the originals 24 hours later. Whole passages rearranged, names moved. A paragraph detailing the ritual of mouthless speech on page 88 disappeared completely from the copy, only to reappear, fully intact, handwritten on the inside wall of the archive's storage locker 2 days later. No one had entered. Brecht's final report was only 3 words: This is alive. The archive was scheduled for destruction by incineration. But when fire was applied, the material did not burn. Not instantly, not slowly, not at all. Instead, the flames bent around it, as if avoiding something sacred or sentient. After 3 failed attempts, the box was resealed and buried under 9 tons of concrete in an unnamed federal facility in West Virginia, but the final tape of Brecht's voice, recorded 3 nights before she vanished, has since leaked online. In it, she whispers, "The archive is not about what happened, it's about what is still happening. Somewhere, the Ravencroft system is still writing, and it wants you to read." Because the 8th law of control is this: if knowledge cannot be destroyed, it was never meant to be forgotten. August 9th, 1996. At precisely 3:06 a.m., 6 amateur radio operators in different parts of the northeastern United States, all tuned to separate, unrelated frequencies, reported receiving the same interference. It began with static, then a hum, then a voice, not loud, not clear, but unmistakably human, speaking in a cadence unlike anything in recorded radio history. Not a language, a pattern. The same pattern repeated every 6.66 seconds with minor tonal shifts, like someone tuning a sermon to the brainstem. One operator, an ex-Marine named Mark Felden, recorded the entire signal. He described it as like being spoken through, not to. He blacked out shortly after the transmission ended. When he awoke, he had carved a spiral into his left thigh, using a screwdriver. He had no memory of doing it. The other 5 listeners experienced similar outcomes. A woman in Boston screamed for 17 minutes without pause. A man in Vermont locked himself in a church basement and refused to speak for 11 days. A college student in Albany wrote 200 pages of verse in an invented language before setting herself on fire. None of them had ever heard of the Ravencroft family. But researchers later discovered something impossible. The transmission frequency, 3.066 MHz, had not been allocated to any station, and no tower in North America was broadcasting that night within a 200-mile radius. When investigators triangulated the signal's origin, all vectors converged on a single point. Ravenwood, New York, the forest, the buried ruins of the Chures, Arch of the Pure Spirit. But here's what turned theory into terror. The final 66 seconds of the recording, when run through software designed to detect audio steganography, revealed a whisper layered beneath the waveform, a digital echo encoded inside the hum, a voice, familiar to no one, recognized by everyone. It said, "You are not tuned in. You are tuned open. This is not a signal. This is a return." The final line? "We no longer need wires. You are the antenna now." And that's the 9th law of control. If the system can enter you, it no longer needs to be found. It becomes you, and you call it truth. Somewhere beneath what remains of Ravenwood, below the catacombs, deeper than the spiral vault, beneath even the sealed room of sorrow, there is a bell. It does not ring. It resonates. First referenced in a disintegrating page of Silas Ravencroft's final journal, known as the Book of Unheard Hours, the bone bell is not made of metal nor suspended by rope. It is crafted entirely from human vertebrae, fused together with calcium paste, marrow resin, and a lacquer made from the powdered teeth of those who spoke out of turn. It was not forged to mark time. It was built to end it. The bone bell was placed in what the Ravencrofts called the Sacral Hollow, a spherical chamber with no corners, no echoes, and no escape. A space where sound doesn't bounce but sinks, where every vibration enters the body and stays there. And once a year, on the midnight of the longest night, the bell was sounded, not with a hammer, with a breath. Caleb, by this time entirely unrecognizable, no longer walked. He slithered. Not physically, but spiritually. Descriptions from the last surviving Inner Circle members say he could unfold from shadow. that he wore a robe made of skin from those who died without names, that he no longer had eyes, only mouths, mouths that whispered the name of the bell, not in speech, but through the bone. When the bone bell was breathed into, everyone in Ravenwood would fall still, completely, not in reverence, in paralysis. Birds dropped mid-flight, flames flickered inward, babies stopped crying, even the wind ceased to rustle the leaves. Because the bone bell doesn't produce sound, it produces remembering. It forces the body to recall every pain it ever buried, every scream never released, every secret you kept from yourself. Some died instantly, others wept blood, but those who endured were called the ringed, and they were never the same. Their spines curved, their skulls thinned, their voices fell to a whisper that shook doors open. They were used as guides, as keys, as sacrifices, and one of them, still unidentified, was found in 1983, buried in a field 11 miles from Ravenwood, wearing robes, head tilted forward, spine fused into a curve. When dug up, their mouth opened on its own, and from it came no words, only the tone. The same frequency as the bone bell, because the 10th law of control is this: if trauma is deep enough, you don't need to hear it again. Your bones will never forget. By the spring of 1846, Ravenwood no longer existed on any official map. Not because it was abandoned, because it was removed. Every government census from 1840 listed Ravenwood as an active settlement with 312 residents, a blacksmith, 2 general stores, and 1 church. By 1850, it was gone. Not marked as unincorporated, not destroyed, just absent. Like it had never been there. No declaration, no disaster, just absence. Researchers now believe this wasn't an error. It was the result of a coordinated effort by the Ravencrofts and their followers, a ritual known as the paper fasting. The goal was simple: erase Ravenwood not just from the world but from memory, and to do that, they had to remove it from language. The ritual had 3 stages. First, the destruction of identifiers. Names, addresses, ledgers, and legal records were burned, not in fire pits, but in a crucible built from church donations and bone ash. 1 document at a time, chanted over by mute scribes, the ink bled into smoke. Second, the silencing of reference. Children were forbidden to speak the town's name. Adults referred to it only as the place. Visitors were turned away, not with hostility, but with misdirection. Trails were covered in brush. Signposts removed. Even the stars were read differently on Ravencroft land. Ezra rewrote their constellations. Third, the unmaking. A spoken rite performed by the entire congregation over a span of 13 days, each day 1 hour longer than the last. A ritual of forgetting. They stood in lines facing mirrors and recited the phrase, "I never lived in the place that never was," over and over. And it worked. By 1860, not a single postal route listed Ravenwood. By 1870, no one in neighboring towns could remember where it had been. By 1900, historians questioned whether it had ever existed at all. Until 1934, when a man named Patrick Gibbons, a railroad engineer, unearthed stone fragments while surveying for a new line. They were carved with the spiral. He took them home. Days later, he shot himself. No note, just 1 phrase written in soot above the fireplace. The map is not the thing, but the thing rewrites the map. Because the 11th law of control is this: if no one can name you, no one can stop you. And Ravenwood didn't disappear. It was erased. By those who lived there. In the 21st century, we fear algorithms, invisible patterns that shape what we see, what we want, what we believe. But the Ravencrofts didn't fear algorithms. They built one, not with code, with people. It was called the Pattern of 13. Long before the age of data science, they discovered that predictability breeds obedience, but randomness, chaos, that breeds doubt, fear, resistance. So they created a cycle, a perfectly timed loop of control that reset every 13 days. The pattern governed everything. What rituals were performed, which followers were elevated, when pain was administered, when silence was enforced, when speech was allowed. Even the spiral itself, carved into the floor of the sanctuary, aligned with 13 lunar intervals per year, not 12. The weeks were renamed. The days had no numbers. The calendar existed only in whispers. Every person in the compound unknowingly acted as a data point. Silas tracked it all in what he called the living ledger, a wall of flesh-paged books lining the chamber of observation. Blood pressure, voice pitch, dream content, volume of tears, duration of screams. He fed these patterns into something far worse than a computer. He fed them into Caleb. Because by this time, Caleb no longer wrote. He no longer walked. He no longer waited. He calculated. His whispers were timed with the pulse of the group. His appearances were choreographed to maximize awe. His silences, the longest of which lasted 144 hours, triggered spontaneous devotion. Followers began preempting his commands before he issued them, because they had been trained, conditioned, coded. This was not religion. This was behavioral programming on a cult scale, and it wasn't just spiritual, it was replicable. In 1968, a CIA memo, declassified only in fragments, references RAV-13 as the most advanced prototype of pre-digital obedience architecture. In the margins, one analyst scrawled, "They created TikTok in 1845, just with candles. Because the 12th law of control is this: once you no longer need to issue commands, you've already won." And the spiral wasn't for worship. It was a feedback loop. In 2004, a construction crew widening Route 9 near Albany struck something beneath the asphalt, something they thought was a tree root or a rusted pipe. What they uncovered was a sealed vault made of black stone, fused without mortar, humming faintly beneath their feet. At its center was a man, not bones, not a corpse, a man, seated in lotus position, eyes closed, skin white as chalk, fingernails grown into the palms, no hair, no breath, no heartbeat, but not rotted, preserved, perfect. And carved into his chest, in concentric spirals around the sternum, were 13 words. "I do not remember my name, therefore I remember the pattern." They called in forensics, then federal agents, then silence. The vault was resealed within 36 hours. The crew was paid off. All mention of the incident scrubbed, but one photograph survived, leaked by an intern who snapped it on a Motorola flip phone, convinced he'd just found a buried monk. He hadn't. He'd found the sealed man, referenced only once in the Ravencroft's forbidden texts, in Caleb's final recorded message, etched into a vertebrae with a razor-thin wire dipped in opium ink. When the spiral nears its return, the sealed will stir. He carries the last scream, not his own, but yours. That man had no mouth, but tissue scans showed fully formed vocal cords, meaning he wasn't born without a mouth. It had been closed, sutured, fused, not by surgery, not by trauma, by choice. DNA testing revealed no matches in any modern database, but tissue samples showed something far more disturbing. His blood was still oxygenating, slowly, as if he were waiting. A living archive, a vessel built not to teach, but to preserve a sound no one had heard yet. And we know this because when recent archers ran ultrasound scans on the chamber, the readings returned something impossible, a low-frequency hum, exactly 3.066 megahertz, the same frequency as the unauthorized Ravencroft broadcast in 1996. This man was a transmitter, and his body was the tower. Because the 13th law of control is this: if the message is strong enough, you don't need a voice, you just need a listener. There was always one spiral missing. In every diagram, every ritual, every architectural plan uncovered from the ruins of Ravenwood, 12 spirals were accounted for, 12 directions, 12 stations, 12 cycles in the pattern of 13. But not the 13th. Until now. In 2021, a drone survey of the forest floor near the Ravenwood blast zone revealed an anomaly. vegetation suppression in a perfect spiral pattern, nearly 200 feet in diameter, carved invisibly into the soil, not by tools, not by fire, but by absence. Nothing grew there, not grass, not moss, not even bacteria in the topsoil. The center of the spiral had a single artifact, a stone chair, facing upward, not toward the sky, but toward something above the sky. No carvings, no inscription, just a seat worn smooth by what must have been centuries of waiting. Beneath it, shallow grooves, not for drainage, but for collection, of what, no one will say. The site was never made public, but a private contractor, one of the surveyors, leaked the coordinates on a dead forum buried in the web archive. In the days following the leak, 5 people visited the spiral. 4 of them have disappeared. The 5th, she returned, without her name. Not amnesia, not trauma, just a look of reverence, of completeness, as if what she'd forgotten had been removed, like a tumor or a thorn from the soul. She had no pulse when first examined, but she was breathing and repeating one phrase: the 13th spiral is not a place, it is when. Calendars warped after that. Devices began counting seconds irregularly within a 5-mile radius of the site. Satellites lost sync, watches ran backward, and all attempts to photograph the center failed, producing only static or a dark smudge shaped like a closed eye. The 13th spiral isn't missing, it was waiting. For what? That's the final law, not the 14th. At the last, because the spiral never ends, it only turns inward, and once you find the 13th, there is no going back. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're a witness. And witnesses don't walk away unchanged. This is the final descent, the innermost coil of the spiral, the point where fact and myth collapse into one another, where time stops being a straight line and starts looping. You see, the Ravencrofts were never about a place, not Ravenwood, not a church. They were about transmission, and transmission doesn't need location, it needs reception. Their final plan, never spoken aloud, never written in the Thorns or the Codex Sangrealis, was never destruction. It was propagation, and it's working. Because every time someone reads this story, every time a whisper is heard behind a silent room, every time a spiral appears in a child's drawing, the Ravencroft system pulses again. They don't need flesh anymore. They need pattern recognition. They need the spiral inside you. And maybe you felt it already. That moment in the middle of this story when your breath slowed without reason. That twinge in your spine like something was crawling from the inside out. That silence you suddenly noticed when the world around you forgot to make sound. That wasn't coincidence. That was installation. Because control is not about chains. It's about permission. And you gave it. You watched. You stayed. You followed the loop. Now you carry it. There is no final scene, no closure, no safe distance. Just this. If you dream of mirrors to